Mistress of Briar Hollow. The year was 1847. In the southern stretches of America, where cotton fields ran to the horizon, there stood a sprawling plantation known as Briar Hollow. It belonged to Thomas Wraith, a powerful plantation owner whose wealth and authority placed him above the ordinary laws of men. His wife, Eleanor Wraith, was composed, poised, and outwardly unshakable. People said she was like marble, flawless and cold, but marble can crack when fire burns beneath it. One evening, Eleanor returned home earlier than planned. A feeling of unease had gnawed at her for days, a shadow she could not shake. When she arrived at Briar Hollow, the house was unusually quiet. Servants avoided her gaze. The grand halls were empty. No music, no laughter, only the heavy, oppressive heat of late summer. She climbed the stairs, moving with a quiet purpose, and approached her husband's chambers. The door stood slightly ajar. From inside came low, unfamiliar voices. She pushed it open. The scene that met her eyes froze her blood. Thomas, the man who commanded hundreds, had betrayed every law of decency. He was surrounded by some of the very men he kept enslaved. Eleanor said nothing. She closed the door behind her, her mind already working, turning shock into resolve. By the next morning, the entire town had received invitations. The message was simple. Mr. Thomas Wraith has an announcement to make tomorrow at noon. The town's stewards and landowners whispered to each other, unsure what scandal might unfold. Thomas had no idea. He would learn the truth alongside everyone else. Eleanor stood by the window, the morning sun catching her eyes. This was not anger. This was calculation. She would ensure that the hidden sins of Briar Hollow would no longer remain in the shadows. And so the stage was set for a spectacle the town would never forget. The sun rose high over Briar Hollow. The plantation's fields shimmered with heat, but the town's people gathered near the grand front gates, murmuring with curiosity and unease. Whispers of scandal had traveled faster than the morning wind. Eleanor Wraith appeared on the veranda, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the columns of Briar Hollow gleamed white in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the storm she was about to unleash. Thomas Wraith emerged from the house, dressed in his finest coat, unaware of the true nature of the gathering. He assumed it was a routine assembly, a display of his power and wealth. He smiled at the townspeople, attempting charm, but the energy in the air was wrong. Something had shifted. Eleanor's voice rang out calm and deliberate, cutting through the murmurs. "Friends, neighbors, esteemed members of this community," she began. "I stand before you not as a passive witness to our society's truths, but as one who can no longer allow deception and abuse to remain in the shadows." The crowd grew still, leaning forward, sensing the gravity of her words. She continued, her eyes fixed on Thomas. "For years, Briar Hollow has represented authority, wealth, and respect. Yet beneath these walls, terrible acts have occurred, acts that betray not only trust but humanity itself." Thomas shifted uneasily, glancing around. The servants and townspeople exchanged furtive glances. Eleanor's tone never wavered, each word calculated, precise. "I invited you all here today," she said, "to witness a reckoning, not of fists or fire, but of truth. The sins of this house, once hidden, will now be seen by all, and justice in the form of exposure and accountability will be served." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Faces turned pale, and some whispered among themselves. Thomas's confident smile faltered. Eleanor continued, detailing the abuses of power, the hypocrisies and the betrayals that had remained concealed for too long. She spoke of authority misused, trust broken, and the human cost of unchecked power. Each accusation landed like a hammer, each revelation weakening Thomas's carefully constructed reputation. By noon, the town understood. Eleanor had not summoned a physical punishment or a scandalous spectacle of shame. Instead, she wielded something far more powerful: truth and perception. She made Thomas's sins visible to everyone who mattered, turning the very authority he had commanded into a liability. The townspeople reacted not with violence but with judgment. They withdrew their support, reconsidered their alliances, and quietly began to distance themselves. Thomas was left alone, stripped of the unquestioned power he had once held, trapped by his own misdeeds. Eleanor, meanwhile, stood tall. Briar Hollow remained hers in name and in legacy, but more importantly, she had restored order according to her own sense of justice. She had ensured that deception could no longer thrive, and that power without accountability would no longer go unchallenged. By nightfall, Briar Hollow returned to its quiet state, but the story of that day spread across the county. Thomas Wraith, once untouchable, had become a cautionary tale. Eleanor's reputation, calm yet unyielding, became legend. She had executed a punishment that required no blows, no public shame beyond truth itself, yet its impact would last generations. The plantation's fields remained, the cotton still rippling in the wind, but everyone knew the balance of power had shifted forever. Weeks passed since the day Eleanor Wraith had orchestrated the town's reckoning. Briar Hollow's fields still swayed in the summer wind, but the atmosphere within the plantation had changed. No one dared speak freely of Thomas Wraith's authority. Whispers of his failures followed him through every hall and corridor. Thomas himself became a shadow of his former self. Once confident and commanding, he now moved cautiously, aware that every glance, every murmur, could carry judgment. He attempted to regain control through the usual displays of wealth and authority, but the townspeople no longer responded. Invitations went unanswered, business dealings slowed, and even his closest associates kept a wary distance. His influence, built over decades, had been quietly dismantled. Eleanor, on the other hand, moved with purpose. She addressed the plantation's operations personally, negotiating with overseers, workers, and the town's merchants. Every decision she made reinforced the sense that Briar Hollow's leadership had shifted. Her authority was quiet, yet absolute. No one questioned her judgment, and the air of tension that had gripped the plantation seemed to bend in her favor. Yet Eleanor did not act out of vengeance alone. She had been mindful to shape this outcome carefully, ensuring that the abuses of power Thomas had committed could never recur. She established stricter oversight, making the hierarchy accountable in subtle but effective ways. Servants and workers, previously fearful of reporting misdeeds, found a cautious voice under her leadership. The town, initially shocked by Eleanor's audacity, gradually came to respect her intelligence and resolve. Invitations to social gatherings, previously dominated by Thomas's presence, were now attended by Eleanor. She commanded attention with her calm authority, never raising her voice, never resorting to spectacle. Her revenge had been strategic. She had used truth as her weapon, turning the community's judgment into a force far stronger than any punishment she could have delivered physically. Thomas, meanwhile, faded into isolation. His attempts to reclaim control only highlighted his impotence. He remained in the house, performing the duties expected of a master, yet his influence outside its walls had evaporated. In time, even the few allies who had remained loyal to him began to seek favor with Eleanor, recognizing the shift in power. By the end of the year, Briar Hollow had transformed. It remained a center of agriculture and wealth, but the human dynamics had changed fundamentally. Eleanor's intelligence, patience, and decisiveness had rewritten the social order. No longer would deception or abuse thrive unchecked within the plantation. Eleanor often walked the fields at sunset, observing the land she now controlled fully, her thoughts quiet but purposeful. She had ensured justice had been served without public violence or scandalous spectacle. Her husband's reputation was irreparably damaged, yet no one had spilled a drop of blood to achieve it. The story of that day, the day Eleanor exposed Thomas Wraith to the judgment of the town, spread far beyond Briar Hollow. It became a whispered tale of cunning and justice, a lesson that power unaccounted for would inevitably fall, and that the clever, patient, and observant could reclaim authority in ways far more enduring than force. Briar Hollow stood as a monument to her victory, a reminder that sometimes the quietest actions carried the loudest consequences. Years passed at Briar Hollow, and the plantation evolved under Eleanor Wraith's measured guidance. The once feared Thomas had become a ghost within his own home, a man stripped of influence, confined to the private spaces of the mansion, and watched quietly by those he had once commanded. Eleanor's reputation grew not from ostentation but from consistent wisdom. She handled disputes with clarity, rewarded honesty, and ensured that cruelty or abuse could find no shelter within her walls. Workers, once silenced by fear, began to act with caution and respect, knowing that Eleanor's judgment was precise and impartial. Thomas, meanwhile, retreated into bitterness and regret. He spent his days wandering the halls, recalling the moments when his decisions had earned admiration and fear, now replaced by indifference. No one sought his counsel. Invitations he once commanded were now under Eleanor's signature, her presence alone enough to draw respect and obedience. Yet Eleanor showed no mercy for the sake of spectacle. Her power was quiet, effective, and enduring. The town had learned from that one decisive day. Lies and abuses might go unnoticed for a time, but truth, once revealed, could dismantle even the mightiest authority. Eleanor had demonstrated that intellect, patience, and resolve could achieve what brute force could not. By the end, Briar Hollow had become a symbol of change, not in wealth but in moral order. Eleanor walked its corridors with calm assurance, her eyes on the fields and the people she now guided. Thomas's shadow lingered only as a reminder of what could happen when privilege went unchecked, a cautionary tale for the generations to come. In the end, justice had been served, not with public spectacle or physical retribution, but with exposure, accountability, and the steady hand of a woman who refused to let corruption persist. Eleanor's triumph was lasting, her name spoken quietly but reverently across the county, a testament to the power of intellect, patience, and moral courage. Briar Hollow remained, grand and enduring, but the balance had irrevocably shifted. The plantation, once a symbol of unchecked authority, now reflected the principles Eleanor had imposed: fairness, vigilance, and the quiet yet unyielding strength of those who wield power wisely. The story of that day, the reckoning, the exposure, and the ultimate shift in authority, became legend. And though Thomas remained alive, he was powerless, a living reminder that no deceit, no betrayal could survive the unflinching eye of truth.